In the last tutorial, we looked at adding text to our window, but what about adding numbers, especially numbers that we want to use with a calculation? Well, the Breezy Python GUI module allows two types of data fields for numbers, an integer field and a float field. So let's see how that works, creating a project that accepts an integer and then displays the square root. I began with label demo.py and I saved as number field demo. I changed the class to an appropriate class. I added an appropriate doc string. I added a title to my window, and I changed my main to call the correct class. Let's get started in our init method. So this is the code to set up our field for the input, where we'll add the user will enter an integer that we will calculate the square root of. So of course we do our label as we've done in the past, but this is the code that adds the input field for an integer. Notice we do have some new attributes here. We have a value equal to 0. We need to initially set this to a value. For an integer, add integer field, the value must be an integer. So you could not put that there. But for a float, you could put either 0 or a float value. And then we also have a width, the width of the input field. Here is our code for the output section. We'll have a label as before. This is labeling that this will be where our square root is displayed. And then we are creating a float field. Again, we need a value. We could, for this value, put 0, but we're going to put 0.0 just as a good rule of thumb to always have the value start with a float if it's a float, and the value start with an integer if it's an integer. The width is 8, and we could change that should you choose. The precision is going to be how many decimal places to display. In this case, we want 2 decimal places. And with a state of read only means that the user will not be able to change what appears in this output field. Now we have our code for our command button. We're adding a button with the text compute. Establishing on the second row at column 0, we are adding a column span so it will appear center. And when this button is clicked, we want it to execute a method that we have not yet created but will create called compute square root. Okay, let's add the event handling method for our button. We're calling it compute square root. Pay attention to your indentation. It should be aligned with your init method. We added appropriate documentation, and the code is going to get the number from the user. It's going to get the square root of the number, and it is going to output that to the output section that we defined. Now before we move any further, note I made an error there. There should have been an equal sign, and I did not put it there. Hopefully you've already noticed that something's missing from our code. As soon as you typed this, you should have thought, am I missing something? We need to add import math. So add that up below your import easy frame. And now if we execute our code, we get our little window. And let's add an integer of 16. Compute the square root is 4. Let's add something that wouldn't have an even number. And we have those 2 decimal places. We could change that precision to something else. And we would have more decimal places displayed. Okay, I've told you multiple times, remember we have to consider that whoever is using our program is an idiot. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that sometimes people enter things to try to break your program, or they don't know better. So what if we tried to use a negative number here? Look what happens when I compute. I'm getting an error on the back end, but the user is not really seeing that information. So how can we let the user know that there's an error? Let's use a try and except. Go back to your code, and we are going to put this whole section in a try block. Notice that we need to indent in our try block, It's going to try this, and if this doesn't work, we'll raise a value error and we'll have a pop-up box that appears like this. So copy this code over and let's see what happens. We add a negative number, compute, and then we get a little pop-up error box.